Hello children, and welcome to today's collective worship. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see what we are thinking about today. And as you can see, our theme is about working together. And sometimes when we're at school, we have to think really hard about how we might have to do this. And sometimes it's about working in a group. Sometimes it's about working in a pair, but we have to think about what we're going to say, what we've got to do, what the grown-up in our class has asked us to do. And that sometimes can be quite tricky. And sometimes we have problems to solve as well. So today we're going to think about a story that happened a long time ago. It's a story, but it's actually a story that has made a big part of history. And when we listen to stories, sometimes it helps us think about some of the themes we are thinking about at school. So the story we're going to think about is something that I know some of you already know about, and it doesn't hurt us to refresh ourselves about stories we know and also how it links to the themes we're thinking about at school. So the story is called The Great Fire of London. Now this dates back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago, going right back to 1666. Which is a long time ago. And the Great Fire of London actually started on the 2nd of September. And it started in a baker's shop in a road that was actually called Pudding Lane. Now, the baker who owned the shop was called Thomas Fariner. Now, there's lots of speculation about how this fire started. Did somebody start it? Was it an accident? I wonder. But there were lots of things that had to happen to solve what people were going to do to put this fire out. Because it wasn't just any small fire, it was a massive fire that affected the whole of London. Now, as you can see, there's a picture there of the baker and where the fire started. I've already told you that the baker's name was Thomas Fariner. And when we look there, it's a little bit questionable about how a fire could possibly start. But we find out a little bit more about how the fire started because in London, going back to all those hundreds of years ago, houses were built very, very close together, and they were made from wood or timber, which those of you who may have a log burner or an open fire at home know that you burn wood to make fire. So if all the houses were made out of wood, it wouldn't take long for them to all go up in flames. And it didn't help because they were so close together, the fire spread very, very quickly. Now, as you can see from that picture, the fire is kind of pointing in a direction. And the reason why that was happening is because the wind was blowing. The wind was blowing very strongly, which meant it forced the fire to spread even more quickly. Now, there were two things that people had to work at, and they had to work at this together. Just as I said at the beginning, sometimes we have problems in our life that we have to try and solve. Now, this was a huge problem because it meant that people could possibly die if this problem wasn't solved. So they had to think, how are we going to put the fire out and what can we do? Now, some people thought Well, the obvious thing to do is to use water. But in those days and all those hundreds of years ago, they didn't have a fire brigade like we have now. People had to all help together to try and put fires out. And what they had to do was actually use water from a very famous river that flows all the way through London, which is called the River Thames. And they literally had to get buckets and buckets of water from the River Thames to try and put the fire out. Now, this was quite a feat because they really didn't have enough people to do it, but lots and lots of people had to work really hard together to get lots of buckets and tried to put the fire out. Now, the River Thames is actually a very long river. It spans 215 miles, and it starts at the Thames estuary and extends all the way through to Gloucestershire. And those of you that know about where the River Thames expands to, it actually then ends up in the North Sea. Now, 215 miles is a very long way. And those of you that know about distances will know that that is actually one of the longest rivers in the whole of the UK. Now, there was somebody very famous at this time, and this man was called Samuel Pepys. Now, he was actually somebody who was known as an English administrator, and that meant that he served as part of somebody in Parliament. And what he did, he kept a diary. Now, some of you might think, well, what's a diary? A diary is something that a lot of people keep, and it's a record of what you do on every day of the week, or every month, or every year. Now, Samuel Pepys kept this diary, and it logged exactly what happened to the fire. And you can see from the picture there what London looked like when it was all ablaze. Lots and lots of flames and dark clouds hovering over the skies. And Samuel Pepys actually wrote quite a compelling record about what happened. He described things like flakes and drops of fire floating across the city. The glass was melting as the heat struck windows. The ground was as hot as coals. So he described things quite graphically and how it appeared. And this helped people to really understand how this fire had impacted across the whole of London. And what Samuel did was explain what he saw to the Duke of York, who actually was going to become the future King, James II. And he explained this to him and said, you're going to have to do something because this fire is spreading very quickly. Now, the future King, James, had to really think very quickly because they had to work together to think, how are they going to put the fire out? Now, it was interesting because whilst the Great Fire of London was happening, something else was happening at the same time as well. And that was the Great Plague of London. Now you can see some pictures of some rats on there. Now these rats infested London and caused something called the bubonic plague, which killed a lot of people, made them very poorly. And when the Fire of London happened, it actually destroyed all these rats. which made London a better and safer place to live. Now, the way they actually stopped the fire from spreading was by using something called gunpowder. And that was used to destroy other buildings so that it stopped the fire from spreading. And not only did they destroy buildings, it destroyed all the rats as well. Now, it was really interesting because when the fire was eventually put out, somebody somewhere had to think, how is London going to remember what happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago? And this actual statue is called the monument. And the monument was built to help people remember what actually happened all those years ago. It was built somewhere between 1671 and 1677 to commemorate the Great Fire of London, which means to remember it. And it also was built to celebrate the rebuilding of London. Now, the monument itself still remains in place in London, and it stands at the junction of Monument Street and Fish Street Hill. So if ever you do go to London, you can maybe ask, if you go around visiting, you might like to go and have a look and see if it's still there. Because now you know the story of the Great Fire of London. Now, I started off the collective worship by saying we have to think about ways we can solve problems. And as I said, sometimes it's on your own, sometimes it's in a group or in a pair. Now, we've heard a story, a historic story, about how people had to work together to solve a massive problem. And sometimes that's what we have to do. Sometimes we can't solve problems on our own. We do have to work together. And this story is an example of how people hundreds of years ago had to do it. But if we think about today, and we think about school, and we think about where we all are, we have to think sometimes about finding solutions to our problems. And that's what I'd like you all to do this week, because this week we are thinking about how we can work together. How can we solve problems? How can we do that? And I wonder if you can now think, how am I going to do that? So let's just give ourselves a little bit of time. You might like to close your eyes. You might like to just put your hands together. Sometimes that helps us think. As you're doing that, I'm going to read a little prayer to think about us all working together. So as we look at the candle, some of you might like to say this prayer to yourself. Some of you might just like to listen. Oh Lord, bless our school, that working together and praying together, we may learn to serve you and to serve one another. Amen. Okay, well, thank you for listening. I hope that's helped you to think about how you may want to work together with somebody, or in a pair, or in a group this week, because that's what our theme is from Jigsaw. We're thinking about how well we can do it. I shall look forward to hearing at your celebration collective worships about how you may have done this week. And I am hoping to pop round to all your classes to hear about your fantastic achievements that all of you are working really hard to achieve in your classes. For some of you, that might be getting better at your writing. It might be getting better at maths or reading. But all we want is for you to do your very, very best. That's all we ask. So I'm going to look forward to coming round and seeing you all this week. And maybe you would like to show me something you feel you've done really well at. So thank you for listening today, and I shall look forward to seeing you all in the week. Thanks for listening, children. Bye for now. Bye.